In the early hours of February 9, 2026, Russian commanders in Kursk Oblast made a decision that would haunt the Kremlin for years to come. What they thought was a calculated risk became the single deadliest tactical blunder of the entire war, and Ukraine was ready to make them pay in blood. This is the story of how Russia walked straight into a trap they built themselves. Let us rewind to August 2024. That's when Ukrainian forces shocked the world by launching a cross-border offensive into Kursk Oblast Russian territory. It was bold, it was unexpected, and it worked. For months, Ukraine held on to chunks of Kursk, turning Russian soil into a bargaining chip. Moscow was humiliated. Putin's propaganda machine went into overdrive, promising the Russian people that every inch of Kursk would be reclaimed. But here's the thing: Ukraine wasn't just holding ground. They were watching, learning, preparing. Fast forward to January 2026, Russian forces had been grinding away at Ukrainian positions in Kursk for weeks, throwing waves of conscripts and armor into the meat grinder. They were making progress slow, bloody progress, but progress nonetheless. Russian commanders believed they had momentum. They believed Ukraine was on the defensive. They believed they could deliver Putin a propaganda victory by fully reclaiming Kursk before the spring thaw. They were wrong. Ukraine's general staff had been watching Russian tactics evolve, rather not evolve. Moscow was repeating the same patterns: massed infantry assaults, poorly coordinated armor pushes, and predictable artillery barrages. The Russians were creatures of habit, and Ukraine was about to exploit that fatal flaw. February 9, 2026, 3 o'clock hours local time. Ukrainian forward observers in the Sudzha sector, one of the most contested areas in Kursk Oblast, reporting unusual Russian movement. Thermal imaging picks up column after column of BTR-82A, armored personnel carriers and T-90M, tanks moving into staging positions. This isn't a probing attack. This is a full-scale offensive. Russian command had committed the 76th Guards Air Assault Division, elements of the 11th Guards Air Assault Brigade, and supporting units from the 47th Tank Division. We're talking about over 8,000 troops, 120 armored vehicles, and dozens of artillery pieces. Their objective? Punch through Ukrainian defenses near Sudzha, create a breakthrough, and roll up Ukrainian positions along a 15-kilometer front. Here's where Russia made its first mistake. They telegraphed the attack. Ukrainian intelligence had been intercepting Russian communications for days. They knew the assault was coming. They knew the route. They knew the objectives. So Ukraine did something brilliant: they let them come. At 4:30 hours, Ukrainian forces in Sudzha began a tactical withdrawal, not a rout, not a collapse. Controlled, deliberate pullback designed to look like they were buckling under pressure. Russian commanders took the bait. By dawn on February 9th, Russian forces were pouring into what they thought was a crumbling Ukrainian defensive line. The 76th Guards pushed hard into the outskirts of Sudzha. Their BTR-82 is rolling past abandoned Ukrainian fighting positions. Russian war correspondents embedded with the units were already filming victory footage, claiming Ukraine was in full retreat. Moscow's propaganda channels ran with it immediately. Russian forces liberate Sudzha. Ukrainian defenses shattered. Victory in Kursk is near. But Ukrainian commanders weren't panicking. They were counting. At 11 o'clock hours, the last major Ukrainian units pulled out of Sudzha entirely, falling back to pre-prepared positions 3 kilometers to the west. Russian forces now occupied the town. They set up command posts. They brought in supply trucks. Consolidated. This was Russia's second fatal mistake. They thought they had one. What they didn't realize was that they had just walked into a kill box. Sudzha sits in a shallow valley, surrounded by wooded hills on 3 sides. Ukrainian forces had spent months fortifying those hills, turning them into overlapping fields of fire with dug-in anti-tank positions. Drone launch sites and long-range artillery coordinates pre-programmed into every grid square. The Russians weren't occupying Sudzha. They were sitting in a grave they'd dug themselves. February 10th, 2026. 5:15 hours. The Ukrainian counteroffensive begins, might with infantry, but with drones. Dozens of Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 drones and Ukrainian-modified fixed-wing UAVs swarmed the skies over Sudzha. At the same time, Hundreds of first-person view FPV kamikaze drones, small, fast, and deadly, begin hunting Russian armor. Within the first hour, Ukrainian drone operators eliminate 14 Russian tanks, 23 armored vehicles, and 2 mobile command posts. Russian air defense tries to respond, but they're overwhelmed. Ukraine had deliberately saturated the airspace, knowing Russia couldn't shoot down everything. At 6 o'clock hours, Ukrainian artillery opens up. American-supplied M142 HIMARS launchers positioned 40 kilometers behind the front begin raining precision-guided GMLRS rockets onto Russian concentrations in Sudzha. Each rocket carries 200 pounds of high explosives and can strike within 10 meters of its target. Ukrainian M777 howitzers and domestically produced Bodana self-propelled guns join the barrage. Over 300 artillery shells per hour slam into Russian positions. The Russians try to counter battery fire, but Ukrainian counter-battery radars immediately detect their firing positions and relay coordinates to HIMARS units. Russian artillery is silenced within minutes. By midday on February 10th, Sudzha is a smoking ruin, and Russian forces are trapped inside. February 11th, 2026. Russian commanders in Sudzha are screaming for reinforcements, for air support, for anything. But here's the problem. Ukraine had been waiting for this. In the 48 hours leading up to the counteroffensive, Ukrainian special operations teams had infiltrated behind Russian lines and mined every major supply route leading into Sudzha. TM-62 anti-tank mines, remote detonated IEDs, and even American-supplied volcano anti-personnel mine systems turned the roads into death traps. Russian supply convoys trying to reach Sudzha are ambushed repeatedly. Trucks carrying ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies are destroyed before they even get close. Without resupply, the Russian forces in Sudzha are running out of everything. Tank crews are rationing diesel. Infantry units are down to their last magazines. At 14 o'clock hours, a Russian armored column tries to break out of Sudzha and retreat east. They make it less than 2 kilometers before running into a coordinated ambush Ukrainian Stugna-P anti-tank missiles. Drones and dismounted infantry shred the column in minutes. Only 11 vehicles out of 47 make it back to Russian lines. Russia's third fatal mistake. They kept throwing good money after bad. Instead of cutting their losses, Russian command doubled down. They ordered the 11th Guards Air Assault Brigade to push into Sudzha and stabilize the situation. It was suicide. By February 15th, 1 week into the battle, Sudzha had become a slaughterhouse. The 11th Guards Air Assault Brigade, one of Russia's elite units, had been effectively destroyed. Ukrainian sources estimate that over 60% of the brigade's combat strength was wiped out in less than 96 hours. Ukrainian drone footage later released to international media showed the scale of the devastation. Dozens of burnt-out Russian tanks and BMD infantry fighting vehicles littered the streets of Sudzha. Bodies were stacked in hastily dug mass graves. Of Russian forces still inside Sudzha were now completely cut off. No supplies, no reinforcements, no hope. Ukrainian artillery continued its relentless bombardment, pausing only to allow drone operators to pick off survivors attempting to flee. At 20 to 30 hours on February 15th, intercepted Russian communications revealed something stunning. A senior Russian colonel in Sudzha was requesting permission to surrender. Permission was denied. Moscow ordered the remaining forces in Sudzha to fight to the last man, so they did. By February 18th, Ukrainian forces began the final phase of the operation. Instead of assaulting Sudzha head-on, which would cost Ukrainian lives, they'd simply waited. Russian forces inside the pocket were starving, out of ammunition, and demoralized. Ukrainian psychological operations units used loudspeakers and drone-drop leaflets to offer surrender terms. Lay down your weapons, and you will be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. Continue fighting, and you will die here. On February 19th, the first Russian soldiers began surrendering. Small groups, at first 2 or 3 men, stumbling out of basements, waving white flags. By February 20th, it became a flood. Over 1,200 Russian soldiers surrendered in a single day. Ukrainian forces processed them quickly, providing water, medical care, and transportation to POW camps. For the Russians who refused to surrender, mostly officers and die-hard loyalists, there was no mercy. Ukrainian assault teams, supported by combat engineers and tank units, began systematically clearing Sudzha building by building. They used thermobaric rockets to collapse structures where Russian holdouts were hiding. They used drones to drop grenades into bunkers. By February 22nd, organized Russian resistance in Sudzha had ceased. The final tally was staggering and humiliating for Moscow. Russian losses in the Battle of Sudzha, 3,400 plus killed in action, confirmed by Ukrainian sources. Russia has not released casualty figures, 1,800 plus captured, including 2 battalion commanders and 1 brigade-level officer. 87 tanks destroyed or captured, including at least 12 T-9OM Pro-IV tanks. Russia's most advanced main battle tank, 140 armored vehicles destroyed or captured, 34 artillery pieces destroyed, over 200 soft-skinned vehicles, trucks, logistics vehicles, etc. Ukrainian losses were comparatively light, estimated at around 200 killed and 400 wounded, thanks to their strategy of using drones and artillery rather than costly infantry assaults. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. The Battle of Sudzha wasn't just a tactical victory for Ukraine. It was a strategic disaster for Russia, and here's why. First, it exposed Russia's inability to adapt. Despite nearly 2 years of grinding warfare, Russian forces are still using the same Soviet-era tactics: mass assaults, predictable maneuvers, and a reliance on overwhelming firepower. Ukraine has learned to counter these tactics with precision, technology, and superior intelligence. Second, it shattered the myth of Russian elite units. The 76th Guards Air Assault Division and the 11th Guards Air Assault Brigade were supposed to be Russia's best. They were annihilated in less than 2 weeks by a Ukrainian force that was smaller, but smarter. Third, it proved Ukraine can hold Kursk permanently. Moscow threw everything it had at Sudzha and lost, badly. Ukraine now controls a significant chunk of Russian territory, and there's no indication they're giving it back. This gives Ukraine enormous leverage in any future negotiations. You can't claim victory when your enemy is sitting on your soil. Fourth, it demoralized Russian forces across the entire front. Word of the Sudzha disaster spread quickly among Russian troops. Morale, already low, plummeted further. Desertion rates spiked. Entire units began refusing orders to attack. Fifth, it sent a message to the world. Ukraine is not just surviving, it's winning. This matters because Western governments are watching. The more Ukraine demonstrates competence and success, the more likely they are to receive continued military and financial support. As of today, February 14, 2026, Ukrainian forces are consolidating their positions in Kursk Oblast. They're not retreating, they're digging in. Intelligence reports suggest Ukraine is fortifying the entire region, building bunkers, laying minefields, and establishing permanent supply lines. This isn't temporary, this is occupation. Russia, meanwhile, is scrambling to figure out what to do next. They can't afford another Sudzha. They don't have the manpower, the equipment, or the morale to sustain losses like that. But they also can't just give up Kursk. Not politically, not strategically. So what's Moscow's next move? Some analysts believe Russia will shift to a defensive posture in Kursk, focusing on preventing further Ukrainian advances rather than trying to reclaim lost ground. Others think Putin will double down again and order another massive offensive, regardless of the cost. And then there's the nightmare scenario. Russia escalates beyond conventional warfare. Tactical nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure deep inside the country. Putin's back is against the wall, and cornered autocrats are dangerous. But here is what we know for certain. Ukraine just proved something the world was beginning to doubt. They can win this war. Russia made a fatal mistake in Kursk. They underestimated their enemy. They overcommitted their forces. They walked into a trap, and Ukraine made them pay for it. So here's the question that everyone's asking now. Will Russia learn from this disaster, or will they keep making the same fatal mistakes? And more importantly, how long can Russia sustain losses like this before something breaks? This is a turning point, not just in the war but in history. Do you think happens next? Will Russia attempt another offensive in Kursk? Or is this the beginning of the end for Putin's invasion? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear what you think. And if you want to stay updated on every development in this war, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This story is far from over.